Welcome back to Coffee Kurosawa, the podcast where a film obsessive and a film fan have a cup of coffee and chat about the movies that matter to them. My name is Ben Filipkowski, and I'm your resident film obsessive, regularly looking up production details and trivia about movies as I'm watching them.
And I'm Farrah Sarpkaya, a person who loves film, but like in a super chill, no matter how many times I see this movie, I am surprised that isn't actually the line sort of way.
And today we are watching The Empire Strikes Back, also known as Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. The second movie in the series chronologically, directed by Irvin Kershner from a screenplay by Lee Brackett and Lawrence Kasdan. More on that later. Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, Alec Guinness, and James Earl Jones all return, joined by Billy D. Williams, Ian McDiarmid, and a now iconic Muppet. If you haven't seen this movie, be aware we're going to be talking about the plot in detail, so if you want to avoid some pretty iconic twists, now's the time to go watch. One of the benefits of summarizing this movie is that the first movie already established all the characters, so we can really just hit the ground running. And speaking of running, that's what our three heroes from the first movie, Luke, Han, and Leia, have been doing in the 3 years since they blew up the Death Star. Well, sort of. Our heroes and their Rebel Alliance are hiding out on a secret base on the ice planet of Hoth. The Galactic Empire, led by Darth Vader, is searching for this base, and Vader is particularly keen to capture Luke on behalf of the Emperor, thinking they can sway him to the dark side of the Force. On Hoth, Luke receives a vision from his ghostly mentor Obi-Wan Kenobi, telling him to continue his Jedi training under Master Yoda. Han and Leia keep flirting with each other. This happens a lot in this movie. After some adventures on Hoth, the Imperials are able to track them down, show up, and stage a ground assault. Luke helps lead a desperate defense while Han, Leia, and the other rebels escape, before Luke is able to escape to seek out Yoda. Finding Yoda in a swamp, much like Shrek, Luke begins his training, encountering the darkness within and without. Meanwhile, Han and Leia hide out on Cloud City with Han's old pal Lando, except it's a setup, and Lando sold them out to Darth Vader. Han is used as bait to lure Luke to Cloud City and winds up frozen in carbonite as a coffee table before being taken away by a bounty hunter. Meanwhile, Lando has a change of heart and saves Leia, Chewbacca, and they begin their escape on the Millennium Falcon. Luke, though, has arrived and goes to confront Vader, despite Yoda and Obi-Wan's warnings. Turns out they were right. Luke loses a hand to Vader, nearly dies, and is confronted with the awful truth. Darth Vader is, in fact, Luke's father, and wants to join forces with him to rule the Empire as father and son. Luke, in sorrow and pain, lets himself fall, almost falling clean off of Cloud City entirely, but is rescued when he reaches out to Leia through the Force. Lando and Leia pick up Luke in the Falcon, and while the Empire has definitely struck back, there's still hope for the future by the time the credits roll. All that being said, Farrah, what did you think of this movie?
So, I mentioned in our first Star Wars episode, also known as Star Wars Episode 4 during Season 1, shameless plug, that I have seen most but not all of the franchise. I was a Star Trek kid, not a Star Wars kid growing up. And I can count the times I've seen the original 6 on 2 hands and have some fingers left, probably. That said, I really loved it. The special effects are so cool. And it really exemplified yet again the power of a really simple plot in conjunction with some deep focus on our characters, on world building and all sorts of stuff, along with something we talked about last time and something that's actually going to be a big focus of what we're talking about today, which is how the heroes, plural, journeys expand with the world around them. What that really kind of boils down to, and what we're really going to focus on today, is really talking through how you follow up the biggest movie of all time. And first off, let's just start with that really excellent, also hilarious summary that you provided. It's pretty basic. They're running. That's it. They're on the run. But it doesn't feel boring. It doesn't feel stagnant because during those, I think it's 2 hours and change, we have a lot of really deep looks into not just our main 3 characters, but into the organizations to whom they are part of, or to like the communities that they're part of, and how all of that characterization comes together, not just as like data points of what the world looks like, but also to really build out the fact that a world exists beyond our main three. And I really want to dive into that and how we are leveraging, our key players here to really start to build on the story that we started in episode 4. I will always have to think about that. and how Lucas and the writing team and, the full production team really took a very simple idea in Star Wars number 4 and expanded it in episode 5 to bring that to life with those simple plots from both films. So talk to me a bit about where characterization fits into that richness as we move into, a more wholesome story. Because in episode 4, we had a lot less interaction with the world. We are really focused on our 3 heroes. Now we're moving into a bigger world. So talk to me about that bigger world and how it comes to life in episode 5.
For sure. I just need to jump back to something you said originally about the original 6 movies, and there's a part of my deep nerd soul that felt that was sacrilegious, because there's the original trilogy, or the OT, and the prequel trilogy, or the PT, and now there's the sequel trilogy, or the ST, and
then there's the AT-AT.
there are 3 of those. There's a trilogy of those. So yeah, it's boy, like back in the days when the prequels were still coming out, there was such a sharp line in the sand of like, oh, are you a fan of the prequels or the original trilogy? Anyways, that's beside the point. Character.
Checking my nerd cred. I get it. It's fine.
Character, and I think looking at like the idea of like character and theme, and characters as like a lens into theme, stands out to me more as I look back on this movie, because like I watched this when I was 5 years old, I think, for the first time. I think I had the flu. My dad showed up at home with I think I had A New Hope, but he showed up with the other 2 movies on VHS, and I just watched them and was like completely spellbound in only the ways that a 5-year-old can be. And that has led me, close to 30 years later now, being completely obsessed with this franchise in some healthy and some unhealthy ways. But yeah, I was kind of struck when I was rewatching this ahead of this episode that I do struggle a bit with like finding some like really interesting themes to mine out of this, because I think like the plot is very meandering in a way. It is basically a chase movie, except for all the digressions for what Luke's up to, and Luke is just kind of navel-gazing for the entire movie. Like, he has a bit of action and adventure at the beginning and the end, but like a lot of the middle action is actually very quiet and introspective in many ways. So we do get a bit more time with these characters. We do get to see what they're all about. And I think that is kind of what stands out to me a bit more now, is that we can use the characters as a lens through which we can see the movie a bit more clearly. And certainly talking about the way that this movie expands on a world that was already created and established. We were talking ahead of recording here about how, to me, certainly, this is like the visual identity of Star Wars is really like codified in this movie. Like, you have a lot of the basics from the first movie, but this one kind of like establishes that kind of like used future grittiness, and I don't want to say griminess, but there's like a in stark contrast to Star Trek, especially, which is all clean lines and like a clean modern future and very utopian in that way. Star Wars isn't quite dystopian, but it's more concerned with like the reality of what day-to-day life is like in this kind of sci-fi setting, even as it's trying to get us to think deep thoughts about space wizards and rebel alliances. So that kind of like notion of like a used reality. There's a layer of wear and tear on everything, and I think this kind of captures an energy of like this galaxy continues to exist when we're not watching it, and certainly like the implication of like that time jump that they have between these movies. Also, like, I mean, not just implies it, like that just outright says like, yeah, things have continued to happen. Um, Part of like Han's arc in this story is he's still kind of caught between two worlds. And I think Han, especially, is like one of these kind of like catalysts for me looking at this movie as like using character to explore morality. Han is the scoundrel. Like he is the explicitly a criminal. He's good. Like he's a nice guy, nice enough. But when we start this movie off, like he and Leia have like all kinds of chemistry, and the thing is that they just won't admit that they care for each other. So they want the other person to be the one to say it first. It's very schoolyard in a very funny way. Like Han is just like lashing out in like the, oh well, he's just teasing you and insulting you because he likes you, and
He's pulling her pigtails.
yeah, it's exactly that energy. And but he's very torn because I think like he starts off, he goes to the general at Echo Base and he says like, I got this bounty on my head, I gotta go clear that up. And the general's like, that sucks, man, but I feel you. Like you got to do what you got to do. Leia wants him to stick around. Who wants me to stick around? Like, you want me to stick around, right? And she goes like, yes, because you're a natural leader. No other reasons, obviously. So like Han's kind of torn between like he clearly wants to stay, but he does have something drawing him away. Of course, that will catch up to him by the end of the movie. Luke, meanwhile, also kind of explores this morality of like Luke is by far the most like black and white, clear cut character in the first movie. He sees things in like good guys and bad guys. Whenever Han does something like remotely roguish, Luke's like, "That's not cool, man. That's not nice." And in this movie, I think Luke's got a bit more understanding of it. And when he's in the dark side cave on Dagobah, like it is explicit foreshadowing for the reveal later on, but it's also about Luke confronting that seductive nature of the dark side and like kind of realizing like maybe things aren't as set in the sand as I thought they were. Like he is explicitly warned by Yoda and Obi-Wan like, look, it might feel good in the moment for you to go and try and rescue your friends, but it's only going to cause more problems. It's like you have to look at the bigger picture here. They're absolutely right. Like Luke accomplishes nothing by trying to rescue his friends. Like they are saved, but they're saved not because of Luke. Like they have to rescue him. So I think Luke is kind of grappling with like things aren't as cut and dry as I used to think they were. Like there are some tough decisions we're going to have to make and tough things we're going to have to live with. So I think this is a lot of discussion on my part just to say like I think that you can certainly find some like thematic richness in the movie itself, but I think a lot of that comes out through how the characters grapple with the experiences they have.
I mean, I think Luke specifically is very much, even if we just think about Pinocchio from last episode, Luke's becoming a real Jedi.
Mm-hmm.
Luke's becoming a real boy. And learning about the nuance of the world, which, he existed in a very small community on a sand planet in the middle of nowhere for most of his life. And now he's spent, 3 years and change with this rebel force who are very, ideologically like sound, but at the same time, like to fight evil, it's so important for him to be able to understand like you're going to feel anger sometimes. You're going to feel all of the quote unquote ugly emotions.
Yeah.
And that's human. But you also have to fight those kind of quote unquote base instincts that make us human to be able to see impact more clearly, more strategically, and all these things. So, I see the simplicity of his story in that he is indeed becoming, a man during these films. And then when it comes to everyone else, I want to skip back to something you said about the grittiness and the reality
Mhm.
of like the set dressing, particularly because like one thing you see a lot in some sci-fi, and I mean a lot of media, is everything is so clean. And like specifically, I'll note anytime I'm watching a movie or a show or whatever, and the character is shown to be like just like a middle class esque person, and their shoes aren't scuffed on the bottom. I'm like, little details like that take it away the reality for me.
Yeah.
But Star Wars does such an incredible job here in this episode, showing the wear and tear on the base, showing the wear and tear on even the Imperial. I had a dreadnought. Is it a dreadnought? Did I get that right? The big one
Oh,
that
the
they're
Star
on with
Destroyer.
Vader. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And like showing even if it is this very like strict military ship, you've got the little droid that cleans stuff running around. Like little stuff like that.
Yeah.
Or in any of their conversations, they'll refer to something that happened. One of the generals comes up to Vader and he's like, hey, we've been looking. We sent all of these ships out to search X, Y, and Z region, and this one is most promising. And they throw in little things like that
Mhm.
of this happened 2 years ago, 1 year ago, giving us a sense of that time period and that time jump. But again, like you said, making it very clear that things have continued to happen while we haven't been looking. And they do such a good job with showing us,
Mhm.
not telling us, that time has gone on, even though we have the vertical scroll at the start, as with any good Star Wars property, that gives us the Coles notes,
Yeah.
right? But yeah, and like if we dive into even like Yoda, who is, I believe, 900 or so, or has been fighting the dark side for 900 years, which means he's older than that. Um, he clearly has a lot of feelings about Vader and about, a lot of different people, about the revolution, et cetera, et cetera. And he doesn't just say it. The way he speaks, the way the actor really brings that grumpiness to life, the way the puppeteer emoted
Yeah.
is just like, oh yeah, he's got some grumbles, and that's not just from like today. That's like a feeling that he has held hard enough that he now lives on a planet by himself in a swamp.
Yeah.
Like,
And
yeah.
yeah. Speaking of like all these things, like those kind of offhanded references, like
Mm.
Han has the reference to that. The reason that he's leaving, that he says that bounty hunter we ran into on Ord Mantell.
Mm.
So that was actually depicted through animation in the Star Wars Holiday Special, which came out, I think, a year, 2 years before Empire Strikes Back. Most of that is entirely forgettable uh, in terms of like actual plot. Um, Deeply memorable if you've found some like bootleg copy that you've been able to see because of how surreal it is. There's also the cool part of it that people like, though, is this animated sequence, which features the introduction of the bounty hunter Boba Fett and their encounter with him on Ord Mantell. So that's like kind of this early like hint towards an expanded universe, which becomes more explicit following this movie and others with like the Star Wars expanded universe, capital E, capital U, which is this like multimedia collection of stories, predominantly novels for a long time. Um, Obviously of mixed quality here and there, but some of it wound up being really incredible and mined that kind of like Luke examining the morality of like who he is and the decisions he has to make as a Jedi. Like there's some great novels that really lean into that. Like, you're the wise Jedi, so people are going to look to you for leadership and decision making in some of these things. And not everyone's going to be thrilled with the decisions you make. So how do you make quote unquote the right decision? Things like that are deeply interesting and make the character really rich and really engaging. So that is something that kind of like stands out a lot more to me upon this view again. And what you're talking about like I'm jumping back to what you were jumping back to, the used future. It is very interesting that like the Imperial presence is clean lines and kind of like harsh brutalism in a sense, versus the rebels have a lot more of that scrappy. There might be a layer of grease on a bunch of stuff, but like it's that kind of like roll up your sleeves, get the work done kind of way. There's a practicality and pragmatism to their outfits, like the costuming, the props and the sets, especially like Echo Base, which is just carved into ice. Like they're kind of making do with what they have, and it's really really cool to see.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean it's all intentionally designed, not just from a set perspective, not just from a this looks really cool
Mm-hmm.
perspective, but in a this exists in a real world that real people are actually using. What is it actually going to look like? How is it actually going to function? Like it's very thoughtful in how culture and use shape our everyday objects,
Mm-hmm.
which really, to me, is what I mean. It's why I studied religion in school, right? It's one of my favorite topics of how does the world around us change depending on what's at our disposal, you know? And I think that is a really good place to pivot into as we expand the scope from episode 4 into episode 5 and we're getting to know again these bigger communities, these bigger organizations and so on, as we start to see characters like the fighter pilots and the photo that they show of all of the fighter pilots,
Mm-hmm.
as we see all of the generals and the emperor on the side of the imperial forces, as we see Yoda and the Jedis, as we see Lando and the city that he commands, and my favorite little throwaway thing, all of the bounty hunters that just assemble for Vader, um, that have spun off their own various properties and
Yeah.
show up in various properties. None of them appear to be an accident, right? And that in and of itself lends itself so well to that expansion
Yeah.
into the broader world until we're getting into next, like episode 6, the rest of the prequels, the sequels, and all the other stuff that came
Yeah.
ahead of it. Because we are seeing, as we start to zoom out, where our little troop of heroes fits into this bigger puzzle that is the wider world and then the wider
Mm.
galaxy.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned specifically the bounty hunters and the pilots, because a lot of these pilots, some of them return from the previous episode, from episode 4. So Wedge is one of the folks in the Rogue Squadron. Showed up in Red Squadron in the first movie. Shows up in this. Returns for Return of the Jedi. I think he's the guy who lands like the killing shot on the second Death Star. Um, Shows up again in Episode 9. They bring him back. They bring back the original actor, Dennis Lawson, and I mean that's neat just because like you get a kind of continuity of a character. This character appears in so many novels and stuff because people like these side characters. It gives them a way to kind of like engage with the world and the setting beyond just like the kind of the pillars that you can't necessarily shake too much. Um, Another fun fact is that Dennis Lawson is Ewan McGregor's uncle. And when Ewan McGregor got the offer to be young Obi-Wan Kenobi, Dennis Lawson was like, "I don't know if you want to do that. Like that might be might be a bit of a risk." Did eat his words apparently, but like, so that's just a fun little connection. But the bounty hunters, especially, like each of those characters has a name and was so like they're just visually fascinating. People wanted to learn more about them. So then you have these authors and other writers and other creators kind of coming in and being like, well, what's this person's deal? Let's give them a backstory. And I think that kind of speaks to some of the creative process for this movie is that by this point, Lucas had established Industrial Light and Magic, the special effects company, and they kind of become like the brain center for a lot of the creative decisions in terms of like the visual design, and a lot of that becomes like Boba Fett is designed by Joe Johnston, who winds up becoming a director in his own right, but designs this character. And I think a lot of it kind of just stems from like, well, this is cool. Like, this is neat. What's this? And then they kind of have to establish some reasoning for it. And I think it all stems from like George Lucas being like, we need like a gunslinger type character. Then you get Boba Fett, and then it becomes all these other things. And that kind of leads me into thinking of like the more collaborative nature of this movie versus the first one. Like the first one is very much George Lucas writes it, he directs it. He does have a lot of help and collaborative support. This movie, Lucas takes a not just like he takes several steps back. He relegates himself to being executive producer. He comes up with the story treatment, farms out the actual script writing to first Lee Brackett, who was a very established author of kind of like pulpy science fiction. She actually had the nickname the Queen of Space Opera.
Oh my god, amazing.
I think she passes away of cancer well before production starts on this film. Like she does a draft, hands it in. I think a year later she passes away. That draft it's got a lot of like the broad strokes stuff that you see in the finished movie. Lucas is not necessarily thrilled with some elements of the script. He thinks like there's still a few things that he wants to zero in on, so he passes the script off to his collaborator Lawrence Kasdan, who he and Steven Spielberg had just hired to do Raiders of the Lost Ark. Lawrence Kasdan delivers the final script. Lucas then hires a veteran director, Irvin Kershner, to come in to handle directing. Before they even start shooting a single frame of this, the three of them sit down, Lucas, Kasdan, and Kershner, to hammer out the story further, to refine the script even further. And from what I was reading, Lucas winds up being like incredibly receptive to the ideas that they bring to the table and to how they challenge his ideas, which is kind of like, okay, great. So you have like there's like a back and forth here. So a lot of the ideas that are coming to the forefront here that you're seeing on the screen, a lot of people have contributed to them. Like, there's a lot of work going into creating this world, and I think that's really fascinating because then that gets reflected in the kind of like expanded universe that is born out of this and the subsequent movies. So there's just this collaboration that kind of suffuses everything that like it's exciting to see. It's like the making of this movie alone is fascinating.
Well, I think the importance of those, like having that singular vision that brings everything together while also mining and leveraging different individuals' creativity, perspective on the world, and so on, really helps bring that like not realism, but like the feeling of being a real place that would actually exist to life. Because like if you have a monolith created by one person, I mean, it can be successful. I mean, look at Lord of the Rings, right? J.R.R. Tolkien was an absolutely brilliant storyteller, created this deep, deep world, but you'd still only really have Middle Earth. We don't really know, like, I mean, obviously, big caveat here, I am not a Lord of the Rings superfan. Stephen Colbert, I'm sorry if you ever hear this, and I say, I don't know about the rest of the universe surrounding Middle Earth. I know we have the Elven lands, but like outside of that, it's all still pretty, it's fantasy England. I know that's very reductive, but like I don't get that same sense of realism and the breadth of universe compared to, obviously, a space opera is going to be galaxies upon galaxies, but you still have very unique perspectives, personalities in these different segments of the story. Because, like, heck, you have a leading lady who is just the most incredible, like, diverse female character that is often reduced in a lot of media, even Star Wars media, to being, like, the princess. But even in this second film, we see her stand up. We started in movie 4. we saw her in episode 4 being a princess, being part of the resistance. And then in episode 5, we really get to see her taking charge. She's fixing things. She's literally getting her hands dirty.
Mm-hmm.
And having a female lead writer to start off that story with, having Lucas as the visionary, and then having all these other folks contributing to all these other stories really brings those unique perspectives into a greater focus. And I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a really excellent example of what can happen if you get a group of writers and or creatives together in a room to say, hey, I want someone who is a gunslinger, because I really like those Western movies. I want that cowboy that's going to come in and going to just like duel someone in the middle of the street. And then someone else goes, hey, I created this really cool armor. And the two of them get together and be like, okay, why is this here? Why is that there? Why is, and really dive into that. And then when you see him on screen, Boba Fett's armor is like, there's chinks in it.
Yeah.
Like when they designed the armor, when they made it, you can see places where it's been dinged, where the paint's come off, all this stuff. So you really go from conception all the way into execution of this very realized, like, I want to know why the chinks are in that armor. Like, that's real cool. How did that happen? How did he get hit? Because he's this, like, super dangerous, like, guy. And all of those little attentions to detail at every level really feed into this.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that bigger history of there's like a half a dozen bounty hunters when Vader is like, I will give you so much money if you bring me this gosh darn ship. And each one of them has that unique like backstory, whether it's fully fleshed or not yet in the novels and the additional properties. But it really, again, brings that to life, which is really cool. Yeah. And speaks to that greater network of people.
Yeah, like that level of like detail that we're talking about, and that kind of like level of creative collaboration being writ large on the screen, it does lend itself to, at least in my mind, the characters being such great avenues for us to explore these bigger ideas. Like, because you have so many people contributing, that implication of a wider world, and certainly like lines from the first movie and lines in this movie implying events in the past. I mean, just like the fact that the big reveal of Darth Vader actually being Luke's father, Anakin Skywalker, like that just opens so many cans of worms of like, well, what happened? Like, how did this happen? And this is part of the reason why we wind up with the prequel trilogy, which through its creation winds up ruining some things. Like R2-D2 knows who Yoda is.
Yeah.
So why is he freaking out about this guy on the planet Dagobah? Like that's a whole. More people have nitpicked these things than I have, and probably to better effect. But it's just the kind of reliance on, for lack of a better word, but implication for world building is really effective here, because you have these kind of like open-ended questions. Some of them invite clear answers. Some of them, I think, are better left to our understanding. Like, I go back to the prequel trilogy with Ninja Warrior Yoda. I don't like that. I like Yoda as the very, like, the entire point of the character being this, like, he has the line, judge me by my size, do you? And it's like, yeah, he's like this little guy with a cane. Like, he's this wise sage, but has such a command of the Force. Not command, but like understanding of the Force. And that's like the point. Like Luke is like probably at his snottiest during these scenes, because he's like, it's impossible. I can't lift the X-Wing out of the swamp. And Yoda just kind of does it. Like he harnesses his knowledge, his wisdom of the Force, and clears his mind. He's able to do it. And Luke says, I don't believe it. I can't believe it. And Yoda says, that is why you fail. And it's this entire idea of like your mind shaping your circumstances, like the idea of almost like clearing your mind, like being free of these emotions, like letting yourself feel, but not be dictated by those feelings. I think is kind of my understanding of a lot of this stuff, but just I love the way that this movie builds out the world and invites people to kind of fill in the blanks for themselves, whether that is other creators or the audience's imagination. I think I've kind of like talked around this a little bit here and there, but like the idea of Star Wars as a franchise being a little overly obsessed with filling in those blanks. It certainly starts with these movies, but I would think kicks off into high gear with the kind of expanded universe desperately working to fill in every single little gap and explain everything. But I think on a more positive read on that would be that like people are so passionate about like their imaginations are captured so much by this world that is created, these characters and these ideas that they want to share, they want to partake, they want to create. So I love that kind of like collaborative energy and spirit that is within this, and those details bring it to life in such beautiful ways.
Yeah. I mean, just to be a wee bit controversial, I would say that anybody that started writing for Star Wars or creating for Star Wars, and even in a professional capacity after, even just we'll say the original trilogy, they're just professionally writing fanfic.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that in the best possible
Oh,
way.
yeah,
Because,
yeah.
that's kind of, the beauty of, and why I think we touched upon this in the last Star Wars episode, why Star Wars as an IP has been so incredibly successful, because you do have all these holes that you can fill. You do have this limitless possibility of a universe and a galaxy where there are millions upon millions upon millions of people and creatures and worlds and all these things that you can just pick one.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think I might have told the story a little bit last episode. I played the Star Wars TTRPG a number of years ago before I really started to watch all of the movies like more thoughtfully. And I picked my friend who is a big Star Wars fan helped me pick out a planet. I used one of the shapeshifter folks. I named them. I created this whole lore, and by the time we were done, I was writing fanfic about my character in the Star Wars universe and looking up like
Mm-hmm.
what does the uniform look like, and doing fan art of my character in her uniform and all this stuff. And the framework that is provided somewhat in episode 4, but in episode 5 it really opens up
Yeah.
this grander universe of potential and storytelling that really does pull us from our close engagement with our three heroes
Yeah.
into that broader world, into the bigger universe of Star Wars,
Mm-hmm.
and into all of the organizations and cultures that are just the tip of the iceberg
Yeah.
into what Star Wars is going to become.
I mean, the first movie hinted at it as well with you have Governor Tarkin, or Grand Moff Tarkin as he is also known, is kind of like in charge of the Death Star, but there's this council of other kind of like regional governors that he's meeting with, other leaders that he's meeting with, and they kind of like they talk back a little bit to Vader. Like some of them are on an equal footing in terms of authority. In this movie, Vader is like supreme commander of the Imperial forces. He is still subservient to the Emperor, though. And I mean, like in the first movie, that implication, like, yeah, there's the evil galactic empire. Obviously, there would be an emperor in charge. We meet that emperor briefly in this movie. I also just want to note that at the start of our episode here, when I was introducing the movie, I mentioned Ian McDiarmid. Ian McDiarmid, of course, is like the iconic actor behind the portrayal of Emperor Palpatine in certainly in Return of the Jedi, and then the prequel movies, and sadly the final chapter of Episode 9 and the sequels. Interestingly enough, he's not originally in this movie. He's in it nowadays. Like if you go watch this on Disney Plus, or you watch it on any version of the movie that was released after 1997, he is in the movie. They put him in the movie to replace the original actor who portrayed the Emperor. The original actor who portrayed the Emperor, was actually an elderly actress in heavy makeup that they composited chimpanzee eyes onto, and then dubbed
Huh.
over with the voice of British actor Clive Revill. That a very different voice, very different look. I loved that version. So for a while, I was very much a purist of like, do not replace the original Emperor. Uh, that's beside the point. Um, that also kind of like invites a whole chunk of discussion around like these movies have changed over the years in some pretty big ways. I was watching it on Disney Plus most recently. I do own it on the Blu-ray versions of the original trilogy, um, but I watched it on Disney Plus. I was a little weirded out watching it because I watched this video about AI upscaling, 4K upscaling in film, and
Mm-hmm.
I started watching this, and I just couldn't stop looking at people's eyes because a lot of people have weird
Mm,
looking eyes in the Disney Plus
yeah.
version. So I think they've done a bit of that. Unfortunately, there's some odd colors and highlights going on. Um, whole other
Oh,
whole
we could
other
tangent so hard
conversation.
on that, but we're not going to
Yeah.
because we have time constraints here. Um, I will say though, looking at the um, looking at the authorial words, looking at the authorial voice and ownership of Star Wars that is now transferred over to Disney and etc. We did talk a little bit about, who shot first.
Yeah.
Way back in season 1. And that continues here. And as we go from episode 4 to 5, and then later on as we go from, George Lucas owned to Disney owned,
Mhm.
all of that extended universe stuff kind of goes away. Well, not goes away, but is deemed non-canon,
Yeah.
and now we must bring it back into canon in a different way, which is a very interesting impact on not just new Star Wars fans who want to get into stuff that is Star Wars related,
Mhm.
but also folks like yourself who have been fans for, the duration of its existence and have multiple like realities in your head of what the real quote unquote Star Wars is, which I think honestly is going to be my pivot into our third conversation piece around human stories, because accuracy of history and perspective on history, what really happened, all of these things is such a human condition.
Yeah.
Like there's my story, there's your story, there's every other perspective in the world of what happens in any given moment. And Star Wars does a really good job in showing those human perspectives and those differences in morality, in
Mhm.
the themes and ideas that Star Wars really wants to try to bring to life without making it sound tropey, without
Mhm.
making it sound like intentional. Because, like, you're not trying to tell me a moral story, but morality is inevitably part of the story that you're telling because the stories we tell are inherently moral.
Yeah.
And I think that's really cool that one of the things you mentioned is the fact that this movie starts to show us the wrinkles
Mhm.
in all of the things and the imperfections of our heroes, the imperfections of the organizations in which everybody exists. So, for example, Lando, who welcomes them to Cloud City and then betrays them, but then spends the rest of the film, I think the way you put it was spends the rest of the film trying to make up for it or
Yeah.
something. But showing that human fallibility and the ability to change and evolve and grow
Mhm.
with more information, with insight, with whatever. And the fact that by the end of the movie, Lando and Leia are off on an adventure trying to rescue Han together
Yeah.
in the Millennium Falcon. And that evolution and that growth, I think, is also a really important piece of that
Yeah.
human nature of that storytelling, and they do a really incredible job with it.
Yeah, yeah. I think that the growth of these characters and using them to kind of explore those more human moments is, I think it resonates pretty well. It's yeah, like you have. I think that there's like a genuinely like. I think like that the whole like Han and Leia romance in this movie is actually like really touching and sweet by the end, but it's very played for laughs for a good chunk of it. But then like you get the actual like when they're letting their guard down around
Yeah.
each other a bit more is wonderful, and it kind of culminates in before like Han might die in the whole like carbonite freezing process,
Mhm.
and Leia finally says like I love you, and iconic line, I know. And just what a killer line. Funnily enough, George Lucas, I think to that day, still thinks that's a bad line. Everyone else disagrees. Everyone else like that's absolutely in character and perfect. Um, but like you have things like that, like the kind of like the growth of these characters, like opening up more to each other. Fascinating. Lando's trying to do what's right. He thinks he's doing what's right for his community. Like he's explicitly the administrator of Cloud City. He is in charge of like keeping everyone there safe, keeping things productive. He cuts a deal with the Empire because he thinks like this is the best deal I'm going to get, and it's nothing personal. It's just business. And like Vader changes the deal immediately. Like who would have thought that someone would move the goalposts? Who would have thought? There's absolutely no real world analogs for this right now.
We said we were staying away from this, Ben.
Yeah, but yeah, like Lando's does spend the rest of this movie trying to atone, and like it's not even like he's immediately forgiven. Like the second that he pulls the pulls his own little rebellion with his loyalists to rescue Chewie and Leia, Chewie immediately goes for the throat. Like is immediately like I'm gonna kill Lando, my old friend, for what he did. And I think 3PO is the only character who's like, maybe we should like trust this guy. Like this might be good. And I think there's a bit that we can have in there about like forgiveness and um, like the kind of like human nature of like people make mistakes, people will try to make up for those mistakes, and I appreciate that the movie's not necessarily heavily moralizing about like the next movie does not spend its entire runtime trying to remind us that Lando did a bad thing. It's like, yeah, Lando did a bad thing. He then spends, the interim between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi making up for it. And by like he becomes like a general in the Rebel Alliance. It's awesome.
Yeah.
And Billy D. Williams rules as Lando. Like he brings so much charisma and charm to that role. And there's like the implication of so much history between him and Han is fantastic and wonderful and has been mined for other stories beautifully. Uh, yeah, like even when I think about it, like the wrinkles here, like the big reveal about Vader being Luke's father. Like Vader is pretty much proposing like let's go depose the Emperor. Like let's do this. Father and son, like the ultimate team up. We're both strong in the Force, and together we can stop them. And I think that like there's like a bit of like Vader realizing like or Vader admitting like yeah, like the Empire is messed up, but we could be less messed up. I don't know. I don't know if he's like try. I don't think it's necessarily altruism, but there is like he has figured out that Luke is his son, and I think that supersedes all his other priorities. Does not stop him from chopping Luke's hand off, though. But
But it's
that
still it's still a very human story that he realizes the children that his beloved wife gave him, or at least one of them, spoilers,
yeah
are still alive, and that he has now found his son alive and also strong in the Force, and he wants to pass the family business down to his son, is like how human is that, like,
yeah
honestly. And the thing that he has found that he is good at is ruling the Empire, I
yeah
guess. So he's like, why not? Hey kiddo, let's set you up as my predecessor, or not predecessor,
successor.
my next in command.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just even the biggest, baddest guy in the whole galaxy, because, he has his own soundtrack. It's all up here. We all know it. We all hear it in our heads.
Yeah.
And even his impetus for doing what he's doing is just the most human at the end of the day. And there's something really, like, I don't know, profound seems too big and cheesy a word, but like it is just a very human story of my beloved died. I went down this path of hatred, and now my redemption is my son, saving my son's life, and this and that. And yeah, like, that is so human.
Yeah, like it winds up being the reason for Vader's eventual turn back towards the light is whatever love he might hold for his son, such as it is, or like whatever like desire to protect his son, like that supersedes all other things for him, and that winds up being a very powerful, wonderful redemption arc. Yeah, like there's just so much. There's so much in these movies that kind of like appeals to a very, I think, like kind of like core, basic kind of morality, or just like baseline emotional storytelling. I don't know. Like there's something like I think we've kind of talked a little bit about how so reliant on archetype and tropes these movies can be, but like that doesn't mean it's bad. Like those things are universal for a reason, because they hold such appeal for so many people. So why not lean on them a bit more? Absolutely.
As media comes out that is more focused on profit rather than like, to get very like pompous about it, art. Star Wars is art. Star Wars is a piece of art that was made with passion.
Yeah.
The first ones especially. And rather than like mining data to say, oh, people really like this story, or oh, these characters really sell well when we have merch, or whatever, and just telling human stories that relate to humans. That's art, y'all. That's all it is. And relying on, rather than all of those data points and trying to appeal to the biggest possible audience actively, and just looking inside the writers and creators beholden to, or that are passionate about this thing, and just saying, go tell a cool story that makes me feel something. Or even just go tell a cool story that is cool and fun, and that's it. And someone will find meaning in it, because that's what happens when you have creatives that are thrown in a room and talk about a thing that they're passionate about. And like that's beautiful. And I think this episode 5 really does a good job of taking those archetypes, those very simple stories, our very basic plot of they're on the run, period, the end, and ascribing stories to each of our heroes and all of those separate folks outside of them, and driving the decisions they make, driving the challenges they face, driving all of these things, just as not looking to be epic, not looking to be cool, not looking to be like the man or whatever, just looking to solve for whatever makes them human, and that's it. And that's that's great. More of that. I want more of that.
I think there's absolutely, like, I think we're kind of discounting a little bit the role that like the cool factor plays in so many of these creative decisions. Like certainly the storytelling is about like you had 3 people in a room breaking down the script and being like, does this work? How can we change this? And you get a stronger script and thus a stronger story. It still relies on like the day-to-day filmmaking. Like you look at the making of this movie, it was a nightmare to shoot. Like the core trio got in like so many arguments with each other. in the brief time they were all on the same set. Uh, a lot of that has to do with the fact that there are some miserable conditions for a lot of stuff. The production of the like that is a whole other podcast talking about the production of this movie, but like I think like the idea of like, yeah, like there are meaningful stories here, but sometimes those meaningful stories come from people saying, "Oh, that'd be cool." So a lot of
Yeah.
those design decisions that inform how these characters look, how the world looks, like the storytelling kind of springs out of like these designers being like, "Oh, this is a cool idea. How can we kind of like keep working on
Mhm.
that?" And it snowballs into this greater thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's like what a lot of really amazing storytelling amounts to is like someone just had like you catch an idea and you just kind of keep adding to it. You kind of keep seeing
Yes.
what works, and you get to this point where it like kind of it becomes this thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even with Boba Fett, like you said, some designer somewhere designed his super cool armor, and then it was like, okay, how do we turn this into a character,
Mhm.
and how do we justify every single piece? Like, not, I mean, not literally every single piece, but like, how do we then take that and put it in the world where it makes sense? And then you
Yeah,
come up from there, you start to have this absolutely incredible mythos around
yeah,
the Mandalorians and the show, The Mandalorian, etc. And that's like, yeah, the cool factor is, I mean, half the reason a lot of people play D&D, myself included sometimes, is the cool factor. Like,
yeah,
I rolled really high. I want to be able to jump off that thing and stab that thing and like make that explode. Like, that's
yeah.
cool. That has nothing to do with the emotions around it, but gosh darn it, I want to do a backflip and my back will not let me in real life. So let's do it in Roll 20 or D&D Beyond. So,
Well, yeah. I mean, like, is that not though like the kind of like emotion? Like you're going for that feeling, that excitement, that
yeah.
thrill, that fun. Like you're
Mhm.
doing something, you're chasing something that inspires you in some way.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of that's kind of I think the core of the kind of like creative decision making here is like
Yeah.
what's inspiring, what's engaging, what's good. Like find that,
Mhm.
mind that, and it
Well, I
works.
think yeah, I think we talked about episode 4 being just a cool little space romp,
Mhm.
and look what it's become.
Mhm.
And that's awesome.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, like even just from like this movie goes above and beyond the first in so many ways. Like you look at the Death Star attack in the first movie, you know, it looks it's visually impressive, but like kind of fairly static shots, I would say. And then like you compare that to like the Millennium Falcon and the asteroid field in this movie, and it's like thrilling. Like it is
It was so
genuinely exciting. There's
cool.
that really cool, the huge asteroid before they wind up in like the space worm, and that shot behind the Falcon, and it like loops up and turns around and dives down. That's so cool. That's just so
Yes.
cool. It looks incredible, and
Mhm.
there is just such a level up in terms of presentation. Like they had more money to do things with. They ran out of money a couple times apparently, which is deeply stressful, I'm sure,
Uh,
for George Lucas. But like, you know, part of the reason why this movie succeeds is that there's a lot more of that kind of like trust and collaboration, and Lucas taking that backseat to focus on things like making sure the effects go well, making sure they have enough money, and just being that overseer of things and letting these people run wild with the ideas.
yeah. Oh, so good. So good. Unfortunately, we are getting about that time that I have to pivot us to wrapping up. Um and so I'm gonna ask the question other than just gesturing wildly to the rest of the episode. If you want to watch something that will teach you about storytelling and about creating engaging worlds, why is Star Wars Episode 5 the movie to watch?
I mean, can I just point to the last
I
hour
just
of
said
discussion?
not. I just said no.
Yeah, I think it's just like there's something universal and inspiring about this, and I think that this also kind of like the idea of a story starting in the middle of things, that in medias res, nature is really thrilling. Like, you're kind of picked up and carried along in this story, and the way that the characters kind of challenge themselves and are challenged by the world around them. I think, like, just in terms of character and presentation, this movie's worth watching for how it takes what is a very simple story and makes it a little more complex, makes it more engaging and more thrilling and enjoyable. Like, this is an adventure to get caught up in. I think that's why it's worth checking out.
Yeah.
But if you just want to watch something on a Friday night, Farrah, why this one?
So, if you want to watch something on a Friday night, I think episode 5 is definitely on the list. And usually I'm not one of those people that likes to jump in halfway through a series. Like, if I'm going to watch a thing, I'm going to watch, the original trilogy and then the first 3, or the prequels and then the whatever. Like, I'm going to go in whatever order is the right order, right? But Star Wars Episode 5 does a really good job of sweeping you up in the action. You don't really need to watch Episode 4 to really get it. They're on the run. That's it. The plot is simple. You don't have to know about all of the politics and everything else. And it gives you a really fun little adventure and a really fun story around coming of age, and not just literally like growing up, but Luke in the swamp, just growing up in his perspective of the world, and some fun politics, some fun little space romps, and just overall a great story around people and community. And it's just, the stop motion is just so gosh darn cool. Just watch it for the stop motion. I gotta say it. Just watch it for the stop motion. It's so gosh darn cool. And that's why you watch it on a Friday night. So with all of that out of the way, and closing on Star Wars Episode 5, what do we have coming up next?
Coming up next, if you folks at home want to watch along and be kind of like up to speed with what we're going to be discussing, so that you can kind of bring your own thoughts to the table, we're going to be watching and talking about Vincent Ward's What Dreams May Come for our next episode. After that, we take a little shift towards some of your favorite films and formative film experiences, an episode dedicated to that. And we're diving into a triple feature about Todd Phillips' Joker alongside Marty Scorsese's King of Comedy and Taxi Driver.
I will take literally any excuse to talk about the movies that I love, so I am super excited and even more excited for your triple threat. So all y'all at home, grab your favorite warm beverage, be it coffee or something else, and join us every other Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts. You can also join us at Patreon as Coffee and Kurosawa. You can also find us on Blue Sky as Coffee Kurosawa Pod. You can find me on Blue Sky, Substack, and Letterboxd as Farrah Sarpkaya, and at sarpkaya.ca, where I lend my voice as a voice actor.
And you can find me on Blue Sky as at the Benjimon, and on Letterboxd as at Benjimon. And I think that kind of brings us to the end of yet another wonderful episode.
Sure does. Roll credits, and we'll see you next time.